The moving truck rumbled down the quiet suburban street, its tires bumping over the uneven pavement. It was a sunny afternoon, and the new homeowner couldn't help but smile as they watched the familiar scene of boxes being carried inside the house. This was the beginning of something new, a fresh start after months of searching for the perfect place to call home. It had taken a long time to find the right house, but this one felt different. Nestled at the end of a tree-lined street, the house had a charm that stood out from the others. It was a quaint two-story, with a small front porch and a garden that, with a little work, would be the perfect place to relax in the evenings. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, and just far enough from the busy city to offer some privacy without feeling too isolated. As the final boxes were unloaded from the truck, the protagonist felt a sense of relief wash over them. Moving had always been a stressful experience, but now that the heavy lifting was over, they could finally focus on making the house feel like home. The excitement of starting fresh was enough to make the long days of packing and unpacking worthwhile. But as the last box was brought inside, a figure appeared at the end of the driveway. The neighbor stood with her arms crossed, her expression serious as she observed the scene. She wasn't tall, but there was something about her presence that made her stand out. Dressed in an immaculate cardigan and slacks, she looked like someone who took her role in the community very seriously. It wasn't long before she approached the new homeowner. "Hi there, I'm one of your neighbors," she said, her voice polite but carrying an unmistakable tone of authority. "I just wanted to introduce myself and let you know that I'm part of the Homeowners Association here. We take pride in maintaining the standards of this neighborhood." The new homeowner smiled and offered a friendly greeting, still adjusting to the idea of living in a place with an HOA. They weren't familiar with the ins and outs of homeowner associations, but they had heard mixed things about them. Some people swore by them, saying they kept everything organized and tidy, while others felt the rules were unnecessarily strict. "I'm not familiar with the HOA rules," the protagonist said, trying to keep the conversation light. "I'm just here to settle in and enjoy the house." The neighbor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, you'll want to familiarize yourself with the guidelines soon enough," she replied. "There are certain expectations when it comes to the upkeep of your property. We all work together to keep the neighborhood looking its best." The new homeowner nodded, still trying to keep the conversation friendly. They didn't want to offend the woman, but they weren't sure they wanted to get involved in an organization that seemed so focused on rules and regulations. They had just moved in after all, and all they wanted was to enjoy their new space. "We'll be sure to take care of everything," they said, trying to brush off the tension in the air. The neighbor didn't seem satisfied with this answer, but she nodded curtly and turned to leave. "You'll learn soon enough," she muttered over her shoulder. "There are rules for a reason." As the protagonist watched her walk back down the driveway, they couldn't help but feel uneasy. It wasn't that the neighbor was outright rude, but there was something about the interaction that felt off. The idea of having someone constantly monitoring their every move didn't sit well with them, but they quickly pushed the thought aside. After all, they had just moved in and didn't want to jump to conclusions. Little did they know, this brief encounter would be the beginning of an unexpected and challenging journey. The woman's warning, however subtle, would soon prove to be more than just a passing comment. A few days had passed since the awkward encounter with the neighbor, and the protagonist was starting to get settled into their new home. The boxes had been unpacked, the furniture arranged just right, and a sense of calm had begun to settle over the house. There was still a lot to do, but the hard part was over. They could finally breathe easy and enjoy their new space. One evening, after a long day of organizing and unpacking, the protagonist sat down in the living room, relaxing with a cup of tea. The soft hum of the neighborhood was a welcome change from the constant noise of the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow through the windows, and the protagonist allowed themselves a moment of peace, taking in the quiet beauty of the neighborhood. But that peace was short-lived. As they sat by the window, looking out over the front yard, they heard the distant sound of sirens. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as the noise grew louder, the protagonist's curiosity piqued. It wasn't long before they saw flashing lights reflected in the window, signaling that something was happening just outside their door. The protagonist stood up, a feeling of unease settling over them. They moved cautiously to the front door, unsure of what to expect. When they opened the door, they saw a police car parked at the curb, its lights still flashing. A police officer was standing near the driveway, talking to the neighbor they had met earlier. The woman's face was flushed with frustration, and she seemed to be gesturing toward the house as if explaining something. The officer was listening attentively, nodding every so often as the neighbor spoke. The protagonist stepped back, unsure of whether they should step outside or just wait for the situation to resolve itself. The officer caught sight of the protagonist standing in the doorway and walked over. "Good evening," he said, his tone polite but professional. "Are you the homeowner here?" The protagonist nodded, still trying to make sense of what was happening. "Yes, that's me. Is there a problem?" The officer glanced over his shoulder at the neighbor before responding. "We received a call from your neighbor about a disturbance," he explained. "Apparently, there's been some sort of issue regarding your property. Is everything all right here?" The protagonist was taken aback. A disturbance? They had only been settling in, minding their own business. Nothing had happened to warrant a call to the police. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," the protagonist said, trying to remain calm. "I've been unpacking, trying to get things set up. There's been no disturbance." The officer gave a nod as if considering the response. "Your neighbor mentioned that there's been some noise coming from your house," he said. "Is it possible that you've been working late into the evening?" "It's just that she mentioned something about loud sounds, but there's no official complaint. Just wanted to make sure everything is all right." The protagonist felt a knot tighten in their stomach. They had been working inside, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. They hadn't been making any noise that would warrant concern, especially nothing loud enough to disrupt the peace of the neighborhood. "I've just been getting settled in," they said. "There's no noise or disturbance, at least not intentionally. I'm sorry if it's caused any issues." The officer seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding again. "All right, well, there's no need to make a big deal out of it," he said. "Just wanted to make sure things were okay. If anything comes up, don't hesitate to call us. But for now, it looks like everything checks out." The neighbor, who had been standing a few feet away, looked frustrated but said nothing. The officer gave a polite nod before heading back to his patrol car, and the flashing light slowly disappeared down the street. The protagonist stood in the doorway for a moment, processing what had just happened. The idea that the neighbor had called the police over something as trivial as an imagined noise seemed almost absurd. But then again, it wasn't entirely surprising. The earlier warning about the HOA and the way the neighbor had acted left the protagonist with the distinct feeling that this wasn't the first time they had gone to such lengths to maintain order. After the police car drove off, the protagonist stepped back inside, locking the door behind them. The quiet that had once felt so comforting now seemed distant, replaced by an odd sense of tension. What kind of person calls the police over a minor inconvenience? And why would the neighbor, of all people, escalate something so small? They couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The HOA, or rather the people who took it upon themselves to enforce it, seemed to have a power all their own, and it was clear that the new homeowner had unwittingly found themselves at the center of it. As the night settled in, the protagonist tried to move past the unsettling incident, focusing on the things they could control. But the thought of the neighbor, someone with so much authority and influence over the community, lingered in the back of their mind. It was hard to ignore the fact that this woman seemed to have the power to create problems where none existed. The next day, the protagonist woke up early, determined not to let the events of the previous evening ruin their day. They had plans to finally unpack the last of their boxes and start organizing the garage. As they moved about the house, they tried to shake the feeling that they were being watched, but it wasn't easy. Every time they stepped outside to grab something from the car or move a box into the house, they felt eyes on them from across the street or through the neighbor's window. It wasn't long before the protagonist noticed that the neighbor seemed to be everywhere. If they were out working in the yard, the woman would appear in her front yard watching them from the corner of her porch. If they went to the mailbox, the neighbor would be outside watering her plants or tidying up her yard. It was subtle, but there was no denying it. This woman was paying far too much attention to them. The protagonist had hoped to be left alone, but it seemed like they couldn't escape the HOA's watchful eye. It wasn't just the police call or the nosy glances. It was the feeling that they were being monitored, that their every move was being scrutinized. And the more they thought about it, the more they realized that it wasn't just this one neighbor. It was the entire HOA that had its eyes on them. There was no doubt about it. They were being dragged into something much bigger than they had expected. Whether they wanted to be a part of it or not, the HOA had already marked them as one of its own. And that meant they would have to learn the rules whether they agreed with them or not. The following days felt strange. The protagonist couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the neighborhood. People seemed to watch a little more closely, to keep track of who came and went and where they parked their cars. It wasn't overt or hostile, but it was there, like an invisible presence in the air, heavy and unspoken. The protagonist had never been one to feel self-conscious, but this new environment seemed to bring out a side of them they hadn't known existed. They spent their days adjusting to life in the house, fixing minor things and making it feel more like home. But every time they stepped outside, there was that familiar feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the neighbor across the street. It felt like the entire community had somehow begun to keep an eye on them. It was a quiet sort of surveillance, as if everyone knew their every move but pretended it wasn't happening. On the third day after the police visit, the protagonist decided it was time to take action. They needed to understand the HOA better, figure out what it was all about, and see if there was any way to break free of the silent pressure that seemed to be building. They couldn't keep living under the shadow of this unspoken scrutiny. The first step was simple enough: attend one of the HOA meetings. Word on the street was that the meetings were held once a month, and the next one was just around the corner. The protagonist figured they could sit in, learn a little about the rules, and maybe even find some answers to the questions that had been lingering in their mind. It wasn't an ideal situation, but it felt like the only way to take back some control. The meeting was held at the local community center, a small, modest building at the edge of the neighborhood. It wasn't much to look at, but it had a quiet, utilitarian charm to it. The protagonist arrived early, nervous but determined. They hadn't known what to expect, but they figured it was better to go in prepared than to remain in the dark. As they walked into the building, they were greeted by the sight of a few familiar faces from the neighborhood. The neighbor who had called the police was there, of course, sitting in the front row with a self-assured look on her face. The protagonist couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration as they saw her, but they quickly pushed the feeling aside. They were here to get information, not to make enemies. The meeting began promptly with a woman at the front of the room calling everyone to order. The room was modest but well lit, with folding chairs arranged in neat rows. The protagonist took a seat in the back, watching the others file in. Most of them seemed to know each other, exchanging pleasantries and discussing neighborhood matters as if this was just another part of their routine. The HOA president, a middle-aged man with glasses and a no-nonsense attitude, began the meeting by outlining the usual business. He spoke about the importance of maintaining the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood, the proper way to take care of lawns and gardens, and the rules regarding the placement of trash bins. It was all very standard stuff, the kind of regulations one might expect from any HOA. But as the meeting wore on, the protagonist began to pick up on something. There was an undercurrent of tension in the room, something that wasn't immediately obvious but became clearer as the discussions progressed. It wasn't just about keeping the neighborhood neat and tidy. It was about control. The more the president spoke, the more the protagonist realized that the HOA wasn't just a set of guidelines. It was a force that held the power to dictate nearly every aspect of life in the community. The neighbor who had caused so much trouble was the first to speak up, her voice sharp as she addressed the president. "I just want to remind everyone that we have to stay vigilant," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "We can't let people get away with not following the rules. It's for the benefit of everyone." The president nodded, clearly in agreement. "Absolutely," he said. "We all have a responsibility to ensure that the neighborhood stays in top shape. We can't afford to let things slip." The protagonist listened carefully, trying to make sense of what was happening. It wasn't just about keeping the neighborhood looking nice. It was about enforcing a certain way of life, a way of living that was defined by rigid rules and expectations. And the more they listened, the more they realized that they had unknowingly become part of this system. The meeting continued, and more members spoke up about various issues, some of them trivial, others more significant. There were complaints about the color of someone's mailbox, the placement of a fence, the way someone had trimmed their hedges. It seemed like every small detail of life was subject to the HOA's approval. The protagonist felt a sinking feeling in their stomach as they realized just how much power the HOA had over their day-to-day existence. But what bothered them more than the rules themselves was the way the HOA members seemed to relish their role as enforcers. They spoke with such authority, as if their opinions were the only ones that mattered. The protagonist began to feel a sense of dread settle over them. It was one thing to follow rules to maintain a community's appearance, but it was something else entirely to live under the thumb of people who believed they knew what was best for everyone. As the meeting drew to a close, the protagonist stood up to leave, their mind buzzing with everything they had learned. They had come for answers, but they had only found more questions. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that there was no easy way out of this. The HOA was a part of the fabric of the neighborhood, and trying to avoid it was like trying to escape a storm that was already upon them. They made their way to the door, passing the neighbor who had called the police on them earlier. The woman gave them a sharp look as they walked past, her gaze full of judgment and something else, something colder. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for them to slip up, to break one of the unwritten rules so she could pounce. The drive back to their house was quiet, the weight of the meeting heavy in their chest. They knew that their life in this neighborhood would never be the same. The HOA was no longer just a distant entity that they could ignore. It was a force that had already begun to shape their life. The rules, the expectations, and the ever-watchful eyes of their neighbors were now a part of their reality, but they weren't ready to give up just yet. The protagonist knew they had to find a way to take back control, to push back against the constant surveillance and the suffocating influence of the HOA. They just didn't know how. One thing was clear, though this was far from over. The days after the HOA meeting seemed to drag on, each one feeling longer than the last. The protagonist couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of being trapped. They had always prided themselves on living life on their own terms, but now, it felt as though someone else was pulling the strings. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable, and it wasn't just the watching eyes. It was the constant reminder that every decision they made was somehow subject to scrutiny. Even the smallest actions seemed to have consequences. Parking in front of their own house felt like an act of rebellion, as though someone would appear from the shadows to remind them of the rules. They hadn't even thought twice about it before moving in, but now it was a constant source of anxiety. Would they be reported for parking too close to the curb? Would someone come over to lecture them about the proper way to trim their hedges or arrange their outdoor furniture? The protagonist couldn't help but think back to that first encounter with the neighbor, the one who had made it clear that the HOA was not something to be taken lightly. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that this was no coincidence. This wasn't just a neighbor who cared about the neighborhood. This was someone who saw herself as the guardian of order, someone who reveled in the power that the HOA gave her. But what made the situation even more frustrating was the fact that the protagonist had never agreed to be a part of the HOA in the first place. They had never signed any paperwork or attended any meetings. And yet here they were, fully immersed in the world of neighborhood regulations and invisible boundaries. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that the HOA wasn't just a group of well-meaning neighbors. It was a system designed to control and enforce conformity. And the protagonist wasn't sure they wanted to be a part of that anymore. It was on one of these particularly frustrating days that they received a letter in the mail. The envelope was thick, official-looking, and stamped with the HOA's logo. The protagonist's heart sank as they tore it open, bracing themselves for whatever complaint or demand was inside. To their surprise, the letter was not a complaint. It was an official notice from the HOA, acknowledging them as a member of the association. The letter outlined the dues they would be expected to pay, and provided a list of rules and regulations that they would be required to follow. There was no explanation of how they had become a member, no mention of any consent on their part. It was simply a statement of fact. They were now officially part of the HOA, whether they liked it or not. The protagonist felt a surge of frustration as they read through the letter. This was it. This was the confirmation that they had unwittingly been roped into something they hadn't signed up for. The list of rules was long, covering everything from lawn care to mailbox designs, and each one seemed more restrictive than the last. The protagonist had never been the type to back down from a challenge, but this felt like a different kind of fight, one where they were already starting at a disadvantage. The letter also mentioned that there would be an upcoming HOA inspection of their property, a routine check to ensure that everything was in compliance with the neighborhood's standards. The protagonist could feel their blood pressure rise at the thought. An inspection for what? It was their house, wasn't that enough? They couldn't help but feel a sense of resentment creeping in, the unfairness of the situation weighing heavily on their shoulders. It was clear that the HOA wasn't going to let them off the hook so easily. But instead of feeling defeated, the protagonist made a decision. They weren't going to let the HOA dictate every aspect of their life. They had come to this neighborhood to live peacefully, not to be constantly monitored by a group of people who believed they had the right to control everything. It was time to take a stand. The first step in this process was to reach out to the HOA directly. The protagonist picked up the phone and dialed the number provided in the letter. The call was answered by a woman with a pleasant voice who introduced herself as the HOA's secretary. The protagonist explained their situation, mentioning that they had never agreed to join the HOA and were concerned about the rules and regulations they had received. The secretary was polite but firm, explaining that the rules were mandatory for all homeowners in the neighborhood and that there was no way to opt out. "But I never signed anything," the protagonist argued. "I wasn't even told about this when I moved in. How can I be expected to follow these rules if I wasn't even given a choice?" The secretary paused for a moment as though considering the question. "I understand your frustration," she said, "but unfortunately the HOA is a part of the neighborhood's governing structure. By purchasing the property, you've agreed to abide by the HOA's rules. They are binding." The protagonist felt a wave of anger rise within them. How could something like this be legal? How could they be forced into this system without their consent? It seemed so unfair, so unjust. But despite their frustration, they knew they needed to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't solve anything. "I just want to understand why I'm being treated like this," they said, trying to keep their voice steady. "Why can't I just live in peace without all these rules and inspections?" The secretary's tone softened slightly. "I understand where you're coming from," she said. "But the HOA exists to maintain the neighborhood's standards. It's not about control, it's about ensuring that everyone enjoys a certain quality of life. We have guidelines in place to protect everyone's property values and ensure that the neighborhood remains a desirable place to live." The protagonist wasn't sure if they believed that explanation, but they didn't argue further. Instead, they thanked the secretary for her time and hung up the phone. The conversation hadn't gone as they'd hoped, but it had made one thing clear. The HOA wasn't going to make things easy. That night, as they sat in their living room, the protagonist couldn't stop thinking about the conversation and the letter they had received. It felt like a weight was pressing down on them, suffocating them with rules and expectations. They had never wanted to be a part of something like this. All they wanted was to live a simple life, free from the constant pressure of others' opinions. But as they stared out the window into the quiet night, the reality of the situation set in. The HOA wasn't something they could ignore. It wasn't something they could fight easily, especially when they were already a part of it without even realizing it. They had no choice but to follow the rules, at least for now, but that didn't mean they had to accept it. The protagonist made a silent vow to themselves that they would find a way to make things work. They wouldn't let the HOA dictate their every move. They would find a way to live their life on their own terms. No matter how hard it was, the road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They weren't going to give up without a fight. The weeks that followed were filled with a mix of frustration and determination. The protagonist knew that they had to figure out a way to live under the ever-watchful eye of the HOA, but they couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Every time they stepped outside, it felt as though there was an invisible set of eyes tracking their every move. Every small task, whether it was mowing the lawn or trimming the hedges, was now an act of potential scrutiny. The protagonist had been doing their best to abide by the rules, even though they didn't agree with them. They had painted their fence the approved color, carefully selected plants for their garden that met the HOA's guidelines, and made sure to park their car in the designated space, away from the street as dictated by the association. But no matter how much they tried to follow the rules, there was always a lingering feeling that it wasn't enough, that something would slip through the cracks and bring unwanted attention. One morning, as they sat in the kitchen sipping coffee, the protagonist heard the faint sound of footsteps on the front porch. It wasn't unusual for someone to walk by, but this time it was different. The footsteps stopped at their front door. The protagonist hesitated for a moment, wondering if they were being paranoid. They stood up and walked toward the door, peering through the peephole. To their surprise, it was the neighbor, the one who had caused so much trouble from the very beginning. She stood there, arms crossed, a stern look on her face. The protagonist's heart sank. They had hoped to avoid further confrontations with her, but it seemed like their luck had run out. They opened the door, trying to keep their tone neutral. "Good morning," they said. The neighbor didn't respond with the usual pleasantries. Instead, she got straight to the point. "I noticed something last night," she said, her voice cold. "Your lawn wasn't properly edged." It's a small detail, but it's important. The protagonist felt a rush of frustration. They had spent hours the previous day working on the yard, making sure everything was neat and tidy. But to hear it wasn't up to her standards, it was enough to push them over the edge. "I've been following all the rules," the protagonist said, trying to keep their voice steady. "I've been doing everything I'm supposed to do." The neighbor's eyes narrowed. "Clearly, you've missed a few things," she said. "The HOA takes these things seriously. If you don't follow the guidelines, it could cause problems for everyone." The protagonist took a deep breath. They could feel the anger building inside them, but they knew they couldn't lose control. They had to find a way to stand up for themselves without making things worse. "I understand that the HOA has rules," the protagonist said, their voice calm but firm. "But I'm not sure this is the right way to go about it. You've been watching me for weeks, waiting for me to slip up. I'm just trying to live here in peace. I don't need constant reminders that I'm being monitored." The neighbor didn't seem fazed by the outburst. In fact, she appeared to take some sort of satisfaction in it, as though she expected the protagonist to react this way. "I'm just doing my job," she said. "And if you want to avoid further issues, I suggest you pay closer attention to the details next time." Before the protagonist could respond, the neighbor turned and walked away, leaving them standing in the doorway, seething with frustration. It felt as though the walls were closing in on them, that they couldn't escape the suffocating pressure of the HOA and its overbearing members. But this time, something was different. The protagonist wasn't going to back down. They weren't going to let the neighbor or the HOA control their every move. The protagonist decided that it was time to take a more proactive approach. They couldn't keep reacting to the HOA's demands and rules. They needed to find a way to take control of the situation. They started researching the HOA's bylaws, digging into the fine print to see if there was a loophole they could exploit, some way to escape the constant surveillance. As they pored over the documents, the protagonist began to realize something. There were many rules in place, but they weren't as absolute as they had originally seemed. The HOA had a lot of power, but it wasn't invincible. There were procedures in place for disputes, and homeowners had the right to voice their concerns. There were even bylaws that allowed for certain exceptions in specific situations. It wasn't going to be easy, but the protagonist realized they had options. Armed with this new knowledge, the protagonist decided to attend another HOA meeting. This time they weren't going to sit quietly in the back. They had questions, important ones, and they were ready to ask them. The next meeting came sooner than expected. The protagonist walked into the community center with a sense of purpose, determined to take control of the situation. This time, they didn't just want to learn about the rules, they wanted to challenge them. When the meeting started, the atmosphere felt different. There was a tension in the air, a palpable sense of anticipation. The president began speaking, outlining the usual business of the neighborhood. But the protagonist wasn't interested in the typical updates or the status of the neighborhood garden. They were here to address the real issue, the overreach of the HOA and its members. Finally, when the time came for open discussion, the protagonist stood up. The room fell silent and all eyes turned to them. It was now or never. "I've been living here for a few months now," the protagonist began, their voice steady, "and I've followed every rule the HOA has laid out. I've done everything that's been asked of me. But lately I've felt like I'm being constantly monitored, like I can't make a single move without someone telling me it's not good enough. I've received complaints from a neighbor about trivial things, and I don't think it's fair." The room was silent, and the protagonist could see the reactions of the other homeowners. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed to agree. But the neighbor who had been so critical of them was glaring at them from across the room. "I understand that the HOA has rules, and I respect that. The protagonist continued, "But I also believe that we should be able to live without constant interference. I'm asking for some space, some freedom to live in my home without feeling like I'm being watched all the time. This is my home and I want to enjoy it without fear of making a mistake." The president of the HOA cleared his throat. "We understand your concerns," he said. "The HOA exists to maintain the standards of the neighborhood, and we do take those standards seriously. But we also understand that there may be situations where things don't always go perfectly. We'll look into your concerns, and we'll make sure to review the rules to ensure they're fair and reasonable." The protagonist felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't a solution yet, but it was a step in the right direction. They weren't being ignored, and their concerns were being taken seriously. Over the next few weeks, the protagonist noticed a change. The neighbor who had been so critical of them didn't seem to be watching as closely anymore. The HOA, while still present, had backed off a bit. The protagonist wasn't sure if it was because of the meeting, or if the HOA had realized that they weren't going to be easily intimidated. But whatever the reason, they began to feel a little more at ease. It wasn't a perfect solution, and the protagonist knew that there would always be challenges ahead. But for the first time since moving into the neighborhood, they felt like they had a voice, and that voice was being heard. The fight wasn't over, but they were no longer fighting alone.